Okay, so we're about to begin. Welcome, everyone. Hello. I hope everybody had a rejuvenating reading break. So today we finally were able to invite a speaker that will shed light on current experiment that he is doing with a group of other scientists. And I'd like to thank you all for being here, as well as our guests. This class is being streamed on YouTube because it's a very important conversation. So we decided that we open it to the public, and those who cannot make it at this time can still access this particular discussion on YouTube, and that we can share it on our website, on our official site on Facebook. So welcome to Global Studies 197, Cultures of Disaster, Perspectives on the Global Pandemic. So the title of our discussion, to be led by our guest speaker, is How Far Has Science Come on Anti-Coronavirus Drugs? With Dr. Lorenzo Valentino White. Dr. White is engaged in the development of small molecule-based broad-spectrum anti-coronavirus drugs by taking inspiration from a group of naturally occurring compounds known as I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce this, Amarylli dossier alkaloids. What does this mean for the people? Surely we don't know what those what those alkaloids mean, but our guest will definitely explain this to us. And what does this mean for big pharma? I think that's a very important question. So, yeah, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Lorenzo White. He is a scientist. Not only is he a scientist, but he's one of the most really progressive, if not radical, scientists I know. He is also an independent research fellow for the Institute for Advanced and Applied Chemical Synthesis in Guangzhou, China. He is in China as we speak, but we are on the same time zone, so that's okay. He received his PhD in organic chemistry at the Australian National University. So welcome, Dr. White. Welcome, Vittorio. Take it away.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Sarah. Can everyone hear me okay? Is the sound okay now?
Yes, it's clear.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I wanted to begin, or I should begin firstly by just getting a few official statements out of the way. I am a research fellow at the IAACS, the Institute for Advanced and Applied Chemical Synthesis here in Guangzhou in China. Now, I'm not necessarily giving a strictly scientific or technical presentation today. So I want to make it very clear that a lot of what I'll be talking about are my own views and reflections on my experience working as a scientist and working as a scientist in the area of medicinal chemistry. What I'm telling you today, or most of what I assume I will be telling you today, doesn't necessarily reflect the views or the goals of the institute or the university where I work. Please interpret most of what I say today, or everything I say today, indeed, as my personal opinions. And the other caveat I want to introduce before we begin our discussion, and I hope it can be more of a discussion rather than a lecture, is that I'm an organic chemist, okay? I'm not a virologist, I'm not an immunologist, I'm not a molecular biologist. So my field is focused on synthesizing molecules. So we look at molecules sometimes in nature, sometimes based on computer-generated pictures of proteins that we're trying to target. There are all kinds of ways we find inspiration for the targets of our synthetic chemical work. We look at those inspirations, and then we try to make molecules. And so my contribution to this area is not necessarily to develop a new, it's definitely not to develop a new vaccine or anything to do with the vaccines. My contribution, if I am indeed able to make one, will be to devise a synthetic route to potentially some new COVID drugs or anti-COVID drugs. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a caveat to the discussion we're going to have today. I suppose I want to make 2 points before we, I suppose, move to an open discussion. Of course, however Sarah wants to run the presentation is fine by me. But I wanted to make 2 points. The first is a scientific one, and the second is perhaps a political one. I wanted to give you some background onto why exactly we're focused on the area that we are focused on. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show you an article that we've just submitted, myself and some of my colleagues. We've just submitted for publication. We're waiting to hear back about whether it's going to be published or not. It's an appropriate article for our discussion because it's a review, and it's a review that summarises our area of work. So I thought I could discuss some of the main points in the article as I show it to you, and hopefully then when it's published, I can share you the published copy. The other thing that's good about this is that this is an article written by organic chemists, so people like me, trying to discuss molecular biology. And so it's written from a perspective of being non-experts, I suppose, in this field. So I hope it's digestible or accessible, at least, to other people from outside the field of molecular biology, because that's certainly not my specialty. So I'm going to share the screen now and see whether or not. Great, looks like it's working. So this is my area of research. It's an area of research that we began at the start of the year. The Amyloidaceae alkaloids, and don't worry, I don't think anyone has ever pronounced that word properly in the history of the word. I certainly don't know how to pronounce it. The Amyloidaceae alkaloids are a group of compounds, alkaloids, compounds that incorporate a nitrogen, a basic nitrogen atom. That's not necessarily so important for our discussion, but they're a class of organic molecule, a class of naturally occurring organic molecule. What we're doing in our lab is trying to use these Amyloidaceae alkaloids to inspire the development of broad spectrum anti-coronavirus drugs. And there are 2 ways that we can do that. We can design compounds that either disrupt host factors within cells that the viruses use for reproduction. So what does that mean? A virus is not a living organism. It's just a very complex chemical, right? It's why for me it's so fascinating, because it gives a window into, or a sense of, perhaps what the precursor to life would have looked like, just a self-replicating molecule. That's all a virus is a molecule, very complex one, that is able very efficiently to make copies of itself, right? But it's not alive in the sense that we would understand, ourselves or even bacteria to be alive, or yeast, other simple organisms. So when a virus infects a host, it has to hijack some of the host's own biological processes, and we call those host factors. And it has to do that because the virus on its own does not have the machinery to reproduce. So it can, if it can hijack the host's biological machinery, that's how it can reproduce. So we can design drugs, and this is a kind of a slightly newer antiviral strategy. We can design drugs to modulate the host factors, right? Modulate as in either inhibit or overexpress, or all kinds of different ways to modulate a protein within the human body. We can modulate the host factors that viruses depend on for their reproduction, and thereby shut down virus reproduction. The other way to inhibit a virus, and I don't know how many of you have followed the latest kind of COVID news. I have to. Pfizer, the big multinational pharmaceutical company, has just announced that they've developed a new drug that targets the main protease of the coronavirus. And proteases are proteins that the virus uses to snip chains of polypeptides into functional proteins. I think that's not so important. It's a protein, a viral protein that is crucial for virus replication. So the other way to disrupt virus replication or inhibit virus replication is to target virus proteins directly. Now, the reason that we're so interested in this group of naturally occurring compounds known as the amyloidaceae alkaloids is that they, the activity that has been uncovered for members of this family of alkaloids in the past seems to mostly fall into this first category that I've shown up here, host factor modulation. And that's a very interesting opportunity to try and fight against this virus medically, right? Why? Well, I'm going to show you down here some numbers, and don't be intimidated by the numbers. It's just a question of comparison, right? So there's been some work recently that has suggested that targeting host factors may be the best strategy for trying to medically intervene against the COVID or against the coronavirus responsible for COVID-19. And remember what I say when I'm saying targeting host factors, what I'm really saying is targeting human cellular processes that the virus hijacks for its own replication. So instead of, if you think of our bodies as a car that the virus is using to drive somewhere, right? The virus gets into the car, it takes control of the steering wheel, and it drives it in the direction that it wants to drive. Instead of, let's pretend that these drugs are like a sniper rifle. One way you could stop the car from driving is to shoot the driver, the hijacker, in the head, right? Which is what direct viral inhibition would involve. What I'm describing now is inhibition of host factor modulation, which is the equivalent of, let's say, shooting the wheels of the car that has been hijacked, right? So the car stops driving, but it doesn't stop driving because you've attacked the virus. The outcome is the same, okay? The advantage with targeting host factors to disrupt the replication of SARS-CoV-2, if you have a look at the rates of mutation, so SARS-CoV-2 has a mutation rate here, right? This is how many mutations or how many substitutions in base pairs, again, that's technical, it doesn't matter, per cell per infection. The point here to take away is that if you compare that to the mutation rate of our own DNA, right? We have an enzyme called DNA polymerase, which can fix errors in replication that the virus doesn't have access to. You see that the rate of mutation is much, much, much slower, right? And so what does that mean? That means that if we can develop drugs that disrupt virus inhibition by targeting host factors, then we can potentially generate medicines that are much, much less susceptible to evolved drug resistance, right? One of the things that I'm sure you're all aware of, it's often on the news, is this constant anxiety, justified, that the virus will evolve immunity to the current vaccines. And that's a real problem. And it's a problem because the vaccines, or most of the vaccines that are currently being developed, and I think I've got some figures up here, they target, here we go, they target a part of the virus known as the S protein, right? The spike glycoprotein. And that's a part of the virus that actually evolves very quickly. And so the anxiety around the capacity for the virus to evolve immunity to current vaccines, or the antibodies generated by current vaccines, is totally justified, because the vaccines target, or they teach your body to recognize, a part of the virus that represents one of the most dynamic structures in the pathogen, right, in the virus. Now, I'm aware that perhaps I'm getting a little bit too technical. Of course, there'll be a long discussion phase where we can discuss any of these points in more depth. I just want to make very quick a few more points. Even though we're targeting host factors, there is a problem with that strategy, okay? And the problem with that strategy is that as this very established, sophisticated virologist called de Klerk pointed out, compounds that are designed to disrupt cellular processes are, by definition, likely to be toxic, right? So we're playing a very fine game between shutting down host factors that the virus can use to reproduce, but also trying not to poison the host, okay? And I just want to make a few comments about the inevitability of future pandemics, or the likelihood of future pandemics, I've called it here in this article that we've just submitted for publication. There's, here we go. So recently, what they call the zoonotic genesis, right, of all 7 known human coronaviruses has been reviewed. And what does that mean? Recently, the evolutionary history of coronaviruses has been very thoroughly reviewed for obvious reasons, and it's very clear that these pathogens all evolve in animals before jumping to human hosts, right? And we call that a phylogenetic trend. One of the things that drives the jump of coronaviruses from animals to humans is, in my view, the growing inequality that defines recent global development, which pushes the margins of society into ever-increasing contact with previously isolated wild populations of animals. And there's a very interesting book that was written some time ago, actually. And again, I can pass all these references on to Sarah, who, if you're interested, can share them to you, describing the way that environmental destruction and biodiversity loss are clearly implicated in the emergence of epidemic or pandemic-causing RNA viruses. And of course, sorry, I forgot to mention, the coronavirus is an RNA virus. That's technical, but that's just some terminology that I'll continue to use. So I wanted to, I think I can stop sharing my screen. Just let me go back to stop share. There we go. So that's a bit of an introduction to my work. I wanted to make a political point as well before we move to an open discussion. I don't want to talk for longer than half an hour without contribution from anyone else. Someone whom I consider to be the greatest scientific thinker of last century once pointed out that the weak points in the abstract materialism of natural science, a materialism that excludes history and its process, are at once evident from the abstract and ideological conceptions of its spokespeople whenever they venture beyond the bounds of their own speciality, right? And I don't know how many scientist friends you have, but it certainly reflects my own experience working with people, colleagues who are brilliant scientists, but then who, when we get to talking about politics or even about things like, if you're a chemist, evolution, come up with very abstract, vague and metaphysical points, okay? This is one of the weaknesses of natural science. Now, that's a weakness that I think scientists need to struggle very hard to overcome. And it's certainly, in my view, by having these kinds of discussions that we can overcome these kinds of things. So I wanted to emphasise that I'm very grateful to speak to you today, not just because I can talk about an area of work that is very interesting to me, but also because this is the kind of work, our discussion today, that scientists, in my view, need to continually engage in to make sure that they don't, as another great materialist once said, fall into metaphysics and idealism. But I'm sure we'll go into that further on in our discussion. And as a backdrop, those quotes I've provided as a backdrop to the thing that I'll finish on before we move to an open discussion. I just want to make it very clear, and I think people have a sense of this anyway, but I want to make it very clear that there is a very clear documented evidence of the extent to which the current pandemic, right, could have been prevented. Okay, it could have been prevented. And I'll give you some examples. In December 2003, in the latter stages of the first SARS epidemic, there was a paper published by a group of European virologists who warned that a profit-driven pharmaceutical industry would be incapable of developing effective, widely available therapies to respond to similar future outbreaks. And they declared, and I'm reading now a quote of theirs from their paper, if the virus does not re-emerge for a couple of years, then the economic incentive for companies to invest in SARS would disappear, right? That's a quote from a paper, and I can pass on the reference to Sarah. And then 13 years later, in 2016, there was a review of coronaviruses. And remember, in 2016, we had already suffered the deadly MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome epidemic, which concluded that it was not a matter of if, but when the next recombinant coronavirus will emerge and cause another outbreak in the human population. Okay, and we can discuss, I'm sure, the implications of those warnings in the context of the current pandemic as part of our open discussion. But I wanted to put that out there, and I wanted to emphasise that the scientific world, or at least parts of it, have been saying since 2003 that this was going to happen. Okay, and we need to ask ourselves, what are the limitations, not just politically, internationally, but what are the limitations within science itself as a discipline, which allow these kinds of warnings to go unheeded, right, by governments. I think that's now half an hour that I've spoken almost. Unless there's any other points you would like me to clarify, I suggest we can, and I'm happy to do that if you'd like me to, but I suggest we can move on to the open discussion phase, if that's what you'd like to do.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. White. I'm sure our students are now thinking of their questions. But before we invite comments, let me just say that that's such a fascinating discussion. I think you have actually presented your work as something that is not super opaque and mysterious to us. So thank you for that.
Pleasure.
Yeah. Is there anybody in the chat that would like to comment or ask a question, or anyone from the class? Okay, so I have a question, Victoria. So we have heard news since I think last week that there's now a drug available from Pfizer that directly basically addresses or attacks COVID, the virus. What is the difference of this particular drug to the one that you have been working on?
Sure, that's a great question. The main difference is, and again, I'll go back to very quickly if I can, sharing my screen if that's okay, just because it's easier to understand these things if we look at them pictorially. the main difference is that the drug developed by Pfizer directly targets the viral enzyme, the viral protease. So it follows this blue arrow down the bottom. The drugs we're working on, their main mechanisms of action, of course, drugs exist or compounds exist, molecules exist that can follow both of these processes described on the screen now. However, the molecules we're focused on follow the green arrow host factor modulation. So we're targeting the host. The drug companies, Pfizer, this drug groundbreaking, which has been announced, is targeting the viral enzymes. And again, I'm not pretending that for 1 second that our approach is the only valid approach or is somehow superior. However, I think it's fair to say one of the disadvantages with targeting the virus directly is that you end up with a strategy or with a compound that is much more vulnerable to evolved drug resistance. And the reason is what I described in the introduction to this presentation, and which is that viruses, or this particular virus, evolves much faster than human beings, right? So the Pfizer drug, even though it targets a part of the virus that is what we call highly conserved, that is a more slowly evolving part of the virus, it still targets the virus. And we have to be aware that in a context where, and this goes for the vaccine too, I think this is a very important point, in a context where the virus is allowed to essentially freely circulate among the human population, drugs that target the virus directly are always going to be susceptible to evolved drug resistance. We see what's happened over time with penicillin, even though that's targeting bacteria and not viruses. We see what's happened with chloroquine, with the first anti-malaria drug. Those compounds lose their effectiveness over time because any time that a virus is existing in a cell at the same time as some kind of mechanism to neutralize it, it is in principle evolving mechanisms to overcome that attempted medical intervention, right? I think that's so. What follows from that, I should be more clear. What follows from that is that, in my view, I think it's important for students to hear. In my view, as a scientist working in this area, it's quite clear to me that there is a limit to how much of this problem medical interventions can solve. If you imagine a situation where, for example, and another way you could say this, I think this is a great analogy for global warming. There's an article I read the other day called "Tech Won't Save Us," right? Science and technology won't necessarily save us from global warming if the political and economic organisation of our society remains unchanged. We have a kind of an unfolding example of that with what's happening with the coronavirus pandemic, where you can imagine a situation where richer countries are able to produce on a fast enough timescale new vaccines, new boosters, new drugs in a way that can stay one step ahead of the newly emerging resistant variants of the virus. However, because those medical treatments, those therapies are developed in the context of a privatised, a corporate medical system, by definition, poorer countries can serve as a reservoir for the virus where it can retreat and continue to evolve new mechanisms to neutralise the latest attempts to attack it, right? So unless we have a global strategy, and a strategy that is not just based on science, but is also based on non-medical intervention, it's very hard for me to imagine how this problem will go away anytime soon.
Thank you. So there's another question here, which I think is related to how you responded to the first question, but maybe you can answer just basically it's a question of which is more sustainable, which is a more sustainable approach in dealing with the virus, continually improving the vaccine for future variants or coming up with a drug for targeting the virus. That's from Jana Aguilar.
Great, thanks for your question, Jana. Look, I mean, my view is slightly biased because I'm working in one particular field. My view is quite clearly that vaccines, coming up with new drugs to target the virus or host factors that the virus hijacks, in my view, is a more is a solution that provides more time. And I don't want to say that, in my view at the moment, because of the nature of coronaviruses and the extent to which this virus has been able to spread all over the world, has been allowed to spread all over the world, it's hard for me to see how any one solution, medical solution, could be totally decisive. Could be what we would sometimes call a silver bullet, right? Could be a single solution that you just, you make one drug, you ship it around the world, everyone takes it once, and then the virus is gone. For me, that seems like a totally utopian idea, at least one that's not based on the extent to which I understand the science. The reason I say that drugs could potentially buy us more time than vaccines is that, at least at the moment, the vaccines, and again, I'm not a virologist, I don't develop vaccines, so I understand vaccines on a kind of a, not necessarily I wouldn't be able to design a vaccine if I had to make one. Please take that as a caveat. However, what I do know is that the vaccines that we're using at the moment target the most rapidly evolving part of the virus, or they teach your body to recognize the most rapidly evolving part of the virus. One of the advantages of small molecule drugs, right, like we're working on, is that they are better suited, in my view, to target more slowly evolving parts of the virus, or indeed host factor processes, so parts of your own body that the virus hijacks to try and replicate. Now, again, I want to emphasize, I think this is a really important point. If you take nothing else away from speaking to someone working in this field, I think it's this. Regardless of the best medical strategy, science can only ever be as strong in a society or successful as in my view, the material and economic foundations upon which the science is practiced. So if we still live in a world where we have massive global inequality, where we have huge biodiversity loss, where we have deforestation, where we have imperialism, right? Where we have all of these problems, it's very hard to see how a strictly medical solution will be able to control this problem. And I gave you an example just before about the way, for example, if the virus is brought under control by medical means in so-called first world countries, richer countries, how does that address the reservoirs of the virus in poorer countries, right? How does that address the place where these viruses are or seem to have emerged, whereby you have poor communities living on the margins of society who are forced further and further into contact with previously isolated populations of animals, right? This is the third pandemic coronavirus. We had SARS-1, MERS, now we've got SARS-2. This is the third pandemic coronavirus that we're facing. It's very clear that unless the organisation of the world doesn't change, this is going to be a continual problem, right? It might not be a coronavirus next time. I mean, coronaviruses are particularly suited to emerge in the way that this one has, by definition. But we've had a few scares with influenza virus too, H1N1, all that sort of stuff. There is a fundamental link between the form that these viruses take and the structure of the modern human world. The viruses are perfectly evolved to exploit the modern human world. And I think that's something that we should keep front and center whenever we're talking about the sustainability of any medical solution to this kind of problem.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions or comments at this point? Okay, because I have one more question. So you were saying, and I think I completely agree with you that the solution to the pandemic is more it's not a technical solution, right? But that technical solution will actually depend on a political decision that has to be uh, implemented on a massive scale, which means addressing not only how the pandemic is being handled nationally, but has everything to do with how nations are situated geopolitically. The imperialistic system has everything to do with what is going on. So my question has to do with that, the political character of the response to the virus. And so far, governments have responded in two ways, either to suppress the virus, right? And there's also, for example, in China, and you may, you know more than I do. So the goal is zero COVID, as you have mentioned before. And that was initially the goal of governments, right? And then some governments recently, I know Japan uh, is currently modified its strategy, and now we just have to live with COVID, right? Live with COVID it's from zero COVID to live with COVID. Those are political decisions that are rarely informed by, say, technical expertise, right? I mean, they're not necessarily, they don't correspond to, whatever scientific knowledge has been harnessed from the research that's being done by scientists like you. But I would be very interested to hear from a scientist. What would be your comment, or what do you think of these political solutions that have been implemented by governments so far?
Mm. Great, fantastic question, and one that goes to the heart of, I think, what we've been talking about. Without a strong political solution, strong measures, you could call it a zero COVID strategy. It doesn't necessarily have to be a totally zero COVID strategy, but it has to be, in my view, very, very strong measures of suppression of the virus. Without that, from my perspective, it seems to me that it's going to be impossible to control this virus. That any medical solution to be actually effective is going to have to be deployed in tandem with all kinds of non-medical interventions. It was, and I'll have to double check this, but I have a memory that when more than a few months ago now, the scientific advisory group to the UK Parliament, where the virus is just ripping through and still causing big problems, right? They mentioned that they provided different scenarios about how the situation could evolve. And one of the things that they emphasised, that I remember from that report, which they very quickly came out and said is just a hypothetical report, was that they ascribed, or they said that there was a very high likelihood that if the virus is allowed to freely circulate in a population that is only partially vaccinated, then the likelihood, of vaccine-resistant strains emerging was extremely high. And that will be the same, as far as I can see, for any medical intervention. When we say, or when governments say, and I look at them now from the outside because I'm living here in China and working in China, but when I see governments back home in the West talk about living with COVID, what they really mean is that, like all other problems, it's the poor, it's the disenfranchised, it's the less well-off people that have to live with the problems of COVID. And, you know, that analogy extends to a global context as well. The so-called strategy of only relying on medical intervention is a strategy that, by definition, favours rich countries and disfavours poor countries, and pushes, a lot like climate change, pushes a lot of the problems of dealing with the virus onto poorer countries. Now, ironically, and I haven't gone into the figures right myself, so I'm not sure, I can't speak with this on this with any authority, but it's certainly something they repeat often on the news here, is that the overall, economically speaking, the impact on GDP of a zero COVID approach is actually less than the approach of just letting the virus rip through the community and trying to vaccinate people as quickly as possible. So it's actually more cost effective. It's the word they often use here. It's more cost effective to pursue a zero COVID strategy. Now, I think that if we were able to, I mean, it's a very, it's hard to imagine in our current kind of nightmare circumstances how this could be possible. But if we could have a global zero COVID strategy deployed at the same time as some decisive medical technology, there might be a way to actually eliminate the virus for good, right? As we've done with other viruses in the past. However, so much would have to change for that. So much would have to happen for that politically to be possible, that it's hard to go into specifics. I mean, I know I'm part Italian, part Australian, so I have family in both countries. I know about the response in both of those places. And one of the things that has been, to me, so hypocritical about the response, especially as the response morphed, as you said, Sarah, from zero COVID to living with the virus. One of the things that was seemed so hypocritical has been, you know, even when we had in Italy or in Australia strong restrictions, there were some exceptions to this. But in general, even at times when there were strong restrictions, you would still go to work all day. You go to work all day, you put your mask on, you go to work all day, and then you come home. But when you come home, if you leave your house after work to go and see grandma, you get a fine, right? But the boss doesn't get a fine for keeping the factory open, right? And there's so you know, for the government to provide welfare, I suppose, for everyone to stay home for as long as it takes, 6 weeks, whatever, around the whole world, right, to totally suppress this virus. I mean, those are the kinds of challenges we have to grapple with. And I would argue that the scale of those challenges is actually not even as big, is much, much less significant than the scale of the challenges we face to deal with global warming, to deal with climate change, right? So this is a really good analogy. It's kind of like a warm-up for climate catastrophe, which is going to require even more international cooperation, even more kind of what people would now say are impossible measures from government. I think my view is we have to redefine what is possible, right? And unless we do, no medical intervention, from my point of view, can be decisive. Unless there is some, I mean, look, there could be some evolutionary turn that the virus takes whereby it just becomes less deadly, probably not less infectious, but less deadly, and it doesn't cause the problems that it's causing at the moment. That's a possibility. However, it's equally possible, or if not more possible, according to various commentators, that it could evolve in the other way and become even more deadly, right? So, so unless we can find a way to cooperate on these issues internally between rich and poor, but then also between rich and poor nations, it's very hard for me to see how any medical solution can be decisive here.
Thank you. I would like to follow up on that. And it's interesting and it's a little bit striking. I think students are also struck by your position that a medical solution to COVID is not enough, that we need a stronger political decision on this. Because in the Philippines, we have a different dynamic. For example, progressive movement here is calling for to the political solution that the Duterte government is offering, which is basically from the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was uh, a draconian lockdown, a militarized response to COVID. It's still a political decision, but it's political repression, right?
Of
So
course.
the alternative to that, so the progressive response to that would be a medical solution. But of course, yours, we we understand where you're coming from, right? The basically that science cannot solve the problem of society, right? So but what would be your and we have heard of news, of course, from corporate media, how COVID is being responded to by the Chinese government in
Mm.
relation to zero COVID. So we've been getting reports that it's really been politically repressive and so on and so forth. And I know that in the middle of maybe 2020, you have relocated to China. So
Yes.
can you tell us more about that experience of the atmosphere there? What exactly what is a zero COVID response?
Sure.
What does it look like for the lives of ordinary people in China?
Sure. I think the last part of your question is the most important, right? Of course, the whole question is important, but the last part we should emphasize. And it's in China, right? And I think zero COVID strategies are going to be different based on every country. There's not going to be one single strategy that works everywhere. There are certain policies here that are very effective, but I would say that they're very, very particular, unique to the Chinese culture and national history and all of that sort of stuff. I have to say, it's very surreal for me, right? I mean, I was meant to come to China at the beginning of 2020. I was held up because of COVID for a very long time, and I had some significant visa issues to overcome to get here. But then most of the pandemic, I suppose, most of the catastrophic news that I hear, it's from inside China looking out, where here, sometimes I wear a mask. I have to, sometimes, for example, to get on a bus, you have to show a green health code. Apart from that, I can't think of any other kind of daily signs that that the virus exists, right? I mean, there's the problem that I can't travel. I can't leave. Well, I could leave the country if I wanted to. The problem would be coming back in, right? It would be bureaucratically very difficult, I suspect. So there's that. That's a real a daily experience that is present to me. Perhaps it's more interesting to talk about when there was a small outbreak of the Delta variant in Guangzhou, where I am. It was probably in about June. I can't remember exactly. Around then, it was very hot, and there were about, I think it peaked around 200 cases. Right now, I remember there was news of an outbreak. They said it was the Delta variant. Within a few days, it had the Guangzhou or the Guangdong. I can't remember whether it was the state or the city government, probably the state government, but I'm not sure. Had they set up all of these mobile testing centres everywhere, right? And there was one set up beneath our apartment building. Within 3 days, or about 3.5 days, they had tested everyone in Guangzhou, right? Everyone. And everyone means 16 million people they had run the PCR, the nasal swab test on, okay? It was free. When the outbreak was detected, we just went downstairs. Literally at our front door, there was a mobile testing centre that had been set up. We did the swab. It took about no longer than 10 minutes, right? And then the information is automatically uploaded to your health code on your phone, which is kind of part of a health app. And if there's no virus detected in your area, your code stays green and you can circulate freely. I think, there are issues. I think in the Western context, I'm thinking specifically about at the moment in Italy, they're having legitimate concerns potentially with the way that a so-called green pass could be used by government for in a repressive way, right? So I think those concerns are legitimate. There might be, in terms of the health code on your phone, there are things that are possible in China where there is a certain view about privacy that would have to be modified if they were applied to a Western context. And those are I think those are technical points that are soluble problems. Those are problems that can be easily solved through technical means. The point that was striking for me was the massive resources that were mobilised instantly for test and trace, right? So non-medical, so a zero COVID strategy is not just about quarantining people. It's also about maintaining a very rigorous and active test and trace system. And the part that strikes me as the most successful pillar in what has been a successful zero COVID approach, non-medical approach, that's happened here in China, is this really, really well-resourced, effective, efficient test and trace system. So I think that would be, there's no point kind of locking down unless you're doing a test and trace. You need a picture of exactly where the virus is. And to go back to my experience of when there was this small outbreak here in Guangzhou, it stayed a small outbreak because when they tested everyone, right after about 3 days, they knew exactly where the virus was. And as far as I understand, I'm not sure specifically on the details, because in our area, there were no restrictions imposed on us at all. However, in other parts of the city, potentially there was some kind of surgical lockdowns, right, that happened. But all of that is only possible when you have a very well-resourced test and trace system. So I think that's kind of that's been the most important lesson for me here about what we need to do to control this virus in a non-medical way. The test and trace infrastructure is fundamental to controlling the virus, and political responses to the virus are not just locking down, right? That's one of many different responses that we could call a non-medical response. In my view, the test and trace infrastructure is in fact the most important response, right? But of course, there are all kinds of other political measures that are also important. I hope I haven't lost you. You still there? Hello.
Hi, Dr. White.
Hello.
Sorry, as we wait for Professor Raimundo, I hope we have more time to discuss. I have a question.
Oh, sure.
So thank you so much for your presentation. I'm just curious, in recognition of the implications of the virus and the state responses to this differing all over per state, per nation, and following the conversation about how a medical intervention is not enough to fundamentally address this, I'm just curious how among your circles who are researching and specializing in this scientific field, if there are ongoing dialogues or even conversations with those with political or capital influence, how we can pursue a more holistic understanding of the virus and how we can move forward with this, because I have learned that it is not enough that we, especially perhaps students like me, for those of us who, it's not enough that we share it on social media or share how we should demand more really from the state, from the government. I'm just curious, in your field, even among your ranks in your field, is there a conversation like this that you are pursuing as well? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I think this really is, personally for me, is a very important issue. Now, unfortunately, I would have to say that scientists, as not a class, but as a group of workers, have been very lacking, unfortunately, in terms of their political awareness and their political organisation. It's something that I have noticed my whole scientific career, the whole time I've worked in science. It's really striking that there's a kind of the best you can get is a kind of a superficial, a kind of an instinctual kind of liberal progressivism that you can sometimes get, but it's one that is totally can be manipulated quite easily by whoever. So unfortunately, I don't really have much I can say about that question, except that I think with this crisis, I think is a perhaps a less significant example compared to the coming crisis, the potentially apocalyptic crisis of global warming. And I think again, and any of my scientific colleagues who may ever watch this, if you are watching, scientists must get political. We must organise politically. We must organise explicitly political formations if we're going to ensure that the labour we perform can actually serve the people rather than act in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's easy to feel, even when you're working in medical science, sometimes you feel that you are doing nothing more from day to day than producing technological hegemony for the capitalist class, right? And the only response to that can come from within the discipline itself, can come from within science itself. Now, there's some very difficult organising barriers that prevent the development of political organisation among scientists. And one of them is the highly kind of internationalised way that the discipline is practiced. So it's rare to kind of stay, at least in my field, in one country for very long, and you're often in a foreign country. And when you arrive as a guest in a foreign country, it's very difficult to begin to establish political organisation. I think I wish there was more I could tell you about this, because I think it's kind of the key question for me as a scientific worker. However, scientists need to get political, explicitly political, and that can only come from the laboratory itself. At the moment, that organisation, in my experience, is just not there. I'm sorry to say.
Thank you. We have a question from Seth. Would you like to ask this question? Victoria, I think you can read this from the chat. Seth, is Seth still here?
Hi, yes. I just can't turn on my camera at the moment. But I think Abby was gonna ask the question first from me. Pero sige, I'll go ahead. Hi, sir. Thank you for being here. As a researcher, what are your views on patents? What do you think are the pros and cons in patenting medical research such as yours? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that medical research that is essential to human flourishing should absolutely not be able to be patented. Absolutely not. I feel very strongly about that. You know, this question, though, is bigger than the morality of an individual scientist. We also have to, you know, if we want to really seriously deconstruct the problems surrounding patents, I think we have to also reorganise the way that science is practiced within universities. You know, one of the reasons that a lot of scientists seek to patent their work is to secure alternate funding streams for their research, right? So I can't give too much of this away, but I'm working on a project that was started as a side project. It's to develop a certain drug that is a kind of it's got nothing to do with antiviral medicine. I've thought of a really efficient way to make this drug. And, you know, one of the appealing things about patenting that work would be to secure more funding to fund our antiviral research. So I personally feel especially with these kinds of crisis technologies, patenting should be absolutely out of the question. Absolutely should not occur. However, it's more complex than just saying that, and I think, you know, to really realise that, we would need a reorganisation of the way that science is practiced and science is funded. And this is a great analogy for some of the lockdown measures. You know, it's useless to just say to everyone, no one can go to work for 2 weeks, for example, or a month, or however long it's going to be, if the state is not able to guarantee people's livelihoods, people's incomes, right? So I think that that's a kind of a good analogy for the kinds of solutions we would have to try and think of to overcome the problem, because I think it's a problem, of patenting crucial medical research, right? And of course, don't forget that the way this fits into global international politics, with certain countries defending patents on coronavirus vaccines, anti-coronavirus vaccines, that are preventing their production in poorer countries. I mean, it's just, it boggles your mind, right, to think that someone somewhere is sitting in an office thinking, if I allow this technology to be accessed by people who need it, who are dying, you know, then our company's going to lose money. That, to me, is just, it's crazy. It's crazy. And again, I would hope that one of the reasons, or one of the things we could do if we were more politically organised as scientists, would be to struggle against that, the way that our labour can be used to make individual corporations rich at the expense, often, of poorer people in poorer countries.
Great. Okay, I think we have a question from Abby, but we're still asking her to post it. But so here's Sophia's question. You mentioned briefly that globalized capitalist systems of productions are directly responsible for previously contained viruses, such as the coronavirus, being released from their natural environments. What do you think governments and scientific communities, especially in the global north, should do to take responsibility for this?
That's a really good question. What I would say is that instead of directly responsible, let's say directly implicated, right? It's kind of a little bit, it's not necessarily so clearly cause and effect, but it's definitely clearly implicated. Things that I discussed before, things like deforestation, biodiversity loss, pushing poor populations into increasing contact with previously isolated wild zoonotic reservoirs, you know, this sort of stuff that we discussed at the beginning of the conversation. Well, what needs to happen? There are very, and I'm not now speaking on on a scientific question, right? So I'm just as much of an expert as any of you on this, but my personal view is that what do we need to do? We need to protect the environment, and we need to combat global inequality. And there are very easy things, I think, that countries in the global north, as you put it, can very quickly do to ensure those things. I mean, we all are familiar. I know, for example, about what certain Australian mining companies do to the environment in the Philippines. Those are things that are totally within the domain of government policy to control. The other point, what's another really easy one? Erasing third world debt, is something that's been floated before and has been discussed before. I mean, just think of what that could do. If someone is living on the edge of the forest and eating or coming into contact with animals that are carrying these viruses, right? Surely we can imagine how increasing that person's quality of life will protect them from existing in that really precarious situation, right? Again, this is not necessarily a scientific question, but to answer from a scientific perspective, and I'll share some of these references with Sarah later, so you can convince yourselves. Really, it's great reading to go back and see how this has been discussed, even in scientific literature before, which is often not so political. There are some very clear things that we can address as a global community. I've just mentioned them: deforestation, biodiversity loss, global inequality. If we can address those things, that's doing a lot to prevent the future emerging pandemic viruses, right?
Right. Thank you. Great. Abby, I thought, okay, so what can you say about remdesivir's performance against COVID-19? What could be the reason why it's not utilized as an anti-coronavirus drug? So that's from Abby.
Sure, Abby, you've obviously done a bit of science. I'll show you why. I'll share my screen quickly. We actually mentioned this in the beginning of our review. One of the reasons it was identified quite early on. I'll see if I can find it here. Coronaviruses are really unique among RNA viruses because there are other RNA viruses that do this, but it's certainly a genetic feature of coronaviruses that defines their reproduction. They have access to genetic proofreading mechanisms, right? And one of the early antiviral drugs that they thought might be potentially useful against SARS-CoV-2 was ribavirin. I'm not the only person who has problems pronouncing these names. That was shown very quickly to have limited effectiveness against COVID-19, and it's because these drugs fall into a category called nucleoside analogues, right? The way they work is that most RNA viruses, like HIV, for example, is a classic case where nucleoside analog drugs have been very successful, relatively speaking. RNA viruses don't have normally very sophisticated genetic proofreading mechanisms. So if you introduce a drug that looks like an RNA base pair, right, but is slightly different, it can be incorporated into the RNA virus's RNA as it's being synthesized, as it's being assembled. And then, whereas when it's incorporated into human cells, you have an enzyme called DNA polymerase, which can correct that error, take it out, right? RNA viruses mostly don't have that kind of genetic proofreading mechanism. And most of the existing anti-RNA virus drugs that are around today fall into that category. That's how they work. They're basically fake base pairs that trick the virus into incorporating errors into its genetic code. RNA viruses have access to some albeit weak, but still real, genetic proofreading mechanisms. So they can pick up on those kinds of drugs and delete them from their genetic code before they can have a decisive effect. I think that was actually mentioned by, I think it was in Science or Nature, by the editor at the beginning of the pandemic. Sorry, I don't know what's happening with my mouse. But that's what I think the reason is. So we need to have, if we are going to make drugs, we need to design drugs that can target the genetic peculiarities of coronaviruses, which those old nucleoside analog drugs don't.
Okay, thank you. So we're about to wrap up, but let me just ask this one last question, unless there's, are there more questions or comments from the audience? Okay, maybe last question. So you have a very clear position on patents, especially for drugs that affect human flourishing, right? So this project that you are developing, this drug that you are developing, can you describe the nature of this, the production of this particular drug? Is it government funded? Is it patent free? Is that how you call it when it doesn't have a patent? How are you? What is the behind the scenes of this drug you're developing?
Well, at the moment, unfortunately, it's just still an idea in my head, right? So it's kind of.
But do you have data for this? And where do you upload this somewhere? How is this? Like, how is this being developed? How do scientists like you develop scientific inquiry? Scientists who are not for the privatization of, who are not for the monopoly of knowledge. How do you do this? You make it available as you go on, as you go through the process?
Well, exactly right. So what I would hope is that, and I'll share my screen again, just so I can show you very quickly. This is some slides from a presentation that the director of our institute gave, and it gives you a bit of a better idea of what we actually do from day to day in the lab. So when I say I'm making these drugs, I actually am physically with these two hands making them, right? I start with chemicals. Here's some examples of some very simple chemicals that I start with. The details on here are not so important, right? The technical details. I start with these chemicals. I can do different, or not just me, everyone in our group can do different reactions on different parts of these molecules, and we can use them to make all kinds of different, more complex molecules. Here's an example from some of my own work. This is an amyloidosis alkaloid I made 10 years ago. And it comes from this Clivia plant, which has beautiful flowers, actually, red flowers. And here's how I did it, right? I took a simple molecule, I did a series of experiments, chemical transformations in the lab, different reactions, and in the end, I was able to use those reactions to synthesize the drug that had been found in nature. So what's the advantage of doing this? Well, the drugs in nature that we've found, they're not complete. I mean, if they were, you could just take a sample of a plant that contains an amyloidosis alkaloid. You could make some tea out of it, drink it, and you would cure your SARS, right? That doesn't work. It doesn't work because the drugs are not yet perfect drugs, right? I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect drug, but they're not yet well suited to inhibit the virus. If I can establish a way to make a naturally occurring compound, right, then I can make modifications to the structure of that compound that mean that the resulting molecule is better adapted to attacking the virus. And I think the director here summed up very clearly that point. There is a limit to the variations in structure that can be obtained by manipulating the natural product. There are far fewer constraints when total synthesis techniques are employed, right? So we can, if we develop a way to synthesize a molecule from very simple chemicals, that gives us an opportunity to make analogues of that compound, and we would send those analogues away, or when I say send them away, we'd give them to our colleagues who would test them for their effectiveness against the virus. Now, all of this, so for example, when I made this particular compound here, I don't know if we've got the publication up. No, I don't think we didn't put the publication up. When I synthesized this natural product, this alkaloid, this amyloidase alkaloid, we published it in a public scientific journal, right? I mean, and that's how I would hope, with this research that we're doing, which is crucial to human flourishing. That's how I would hope we would proceed, right? We would just, when we complete the discovery, we publish it in a journal. There's a kind of a very small side point about the problem with a lot of those journals, which is they take our discoveries and put them behind a paywall, and that's a kind of a problem that is related to this problem of patenting. But of course, as authors of papers, we're allowed to send our work to anyone we like, right? So if anyone's interested, you can contact me through Sarah potentially, and I can send you whatever papers you like. When the project is at such a kind of an early stage, that's how I would imagine we proceed. Is that when we're able to identify some compounds that have a significant enough activity against coronaviruses, that we'll publish those findings as soon as possible in a public journal.
Okay, so if you publish this in a public journal, how do you protect yourself from, how do you protect this particular research from being appropriated by profiteering corporations, big pharma, for example?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. It's something I'm absolutely anxious about, and it's something I think we will have to discuss with some patent lawyers if we get close to actually publishing something, because it will be my strong view that any discoveries we make should be for the good of all. And I don't know what kinds of steps we need to take at the level of patent law to ensure that our discoveries remain public internationally in that sense. So it will involve, I assume, discussion with lawyers or whoever who can suggest to us the proper instrument that we need to use to protect our discoveries from profiteering of big pharma.
Right. Wow. This has been a very fascinating discussion. If only we could have you every Wednesday and Friday for the rest of the semester. But yeah, thank you so much. Do you have a parting shot?
Parting shot?
Seven last words for the class.
There's a really good, I want to just, we've been discussing how scientists should be more political, and there's a really good place that I think you can look, that you can begin, that kind of intersects between our disciplines, between the arts, humanities and science. There was a Soviet physicist called Boris Hessen who wrote a very interesting little booklet called The Social and Economic Roots of Newton's Principia, right? The Principia, what was it, mathematical, so the Principia something was Newton's, the name of Newton, Isaac Newton's famous groundbreaking publication. And this book by Boris Hessen looks at the social and economic roots of those scientific discoveries. It's very clear, especially for me, as a scientist, when you work on a very small and technical and specialized area of a discipline, it's so clear how everything we do is totally dependent on, the hundreds of years of scientific inquiry that has come before us, but also the labour in the society that provides the material foundation upon which we practice our science. And I hope that we can, at all times, when we're thinking about scientists, move away from the position of the kind of the genius theory of bourgeois philosophy, which is like idealist a priorism, that you have certain individuals who are just born as geniuses and then do great things. I would hope that in the context of any great scientific discovery, we always remember that what is decisive is collective wisdom.
Thank you so much. yeah, and this will not be, I hope that this will not be the last time that our class could be in conversation with you. We can still continue this conversation either through, email,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah. So I think, well, one of the most important things that we have learned, well, first of all, we can always, this is recorded, so we can access this. This is live on YouTube. So we can go back to the stuff that, the scientific stuff that we need to hear again from the lecture. But thank you so much for, for your clarity and for making this discussion super accessible for all of us. What I've learned is that, well, we may not be, not all of us can be a chemist, not all of us can be a scientist. And what Dr. White was actually telling us is that, well, we don't have to be scientists to be able to contribute significantly to this global situation. But all of us can be, all of us can take back and fight back from this system of monopoly, from the system of accumulation, from the system of dispossession, regardless of our fields, regardless of where we belong regardless of our social class, except of course if we belong to the 1%. But I don't think one of us belongs to that class, right? So thank you so much, Dr. White, Comrade Dr. White. Thank you everyone for being here today, and especially those who commented and asked really brilliant questions. So we end here, and we will continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.